would serve as the United States Senator. But they did envision someone like Donald Trump being President of the United States, someone who thinks he is above the law and that rules don't apply to him. So they made sure our democracy had the tool of impeachment to stop that kind of abuse of power. The House managers have clearly laid out a compelling case and evidence of Donald Trump's misconduct. They have shown that the President of the United States of America withheld military aid and a coveted White House meeting for his political gain. He wanted a foreign country to announce, not actually conduct, announce an investigation into his political rivals. And then he refused to comply with congressional investigations into his misconduct. And unfortunately, a majority of United States senators, even those who concede that what Donald Trump did was wrong, are nonetheless going to refuse to hold him accountable. The Senate trial of Donald Trump has been a miscarriage of justice. Donald Trump is going to get away with abusing his position of power for personal gain, abusing his position of power to stop Congress from looking into his misconduct, and falsely claiming he's been exonerated. He's going to escape accountability because a majority of senators have decided to let him. They voted repeatedly to block key evidence like witnesses and documents that could have shed light on the full truth. And we must recognize that still in America, there are two systems of justice, one for the powerful and another for everyone else. So let's speak the truth about what our two systems of justice actually mean in the real world. It means that in our country, too many people walk into courthouses and face systemic bias. Too often, they lack adequate legal representation, whether they are overworked, underpaid, or both. It means that a young man named Emmett Till was falsely accused and then murdered, but his murderer didn't have to spend a day in jail. It means that 4 young black men had their lives taken and turned upside down after being falsely accused of a crime in Groveland, Florida. It means that right now, too many people in America are sitting in jail without having yet been convicted of a crime, but simply because they cannot afford bail. And it means that future presidents of the United States will remember that the United States Senate failed to hold Donald Trump accountable, and they will be emboldened to abuse their power, knowing there will be no consequence. Donald Trump knows all this better than anybody. He may not acknowledge that we have two systems of justice, but he knows the institutions in this country, be it courts or the Senate, are set up to protect powerful people like him. He told us as much when regarding the sexual assault of women. He said, quote, "When you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything." He said that Article 2 of the United States Constitution gives him as president the right to do whatever he wants. Trump has shown us through his words and actions that he thinks he is above the law. And when the American people see the president acting as though he is above the law, it understandably leaves them feeling untrustful of our system of justice, distrustful of our democracy. When the United States Senate refuses to hold him accountable, it reinforces that loss of trust in our system. Now, I'm under no illusion that this body is poised to hold this president accountable. But despite the conduct of the United States Senate in this impeachment trial, the American people must continue to strive toward the more perfect union that our Constitution promises. And it's going to take all of us in every state, every town, everywhere, to continue fighting for the best of who we are as a country. We each have an important role to play in fighting for those words inscribed on that United States Supreme Court: equal justice under law. Frederick Douglass, who, like many, I consider to be one of the founders of our nation, wrote that, quote, "The whole history of the progress of human liberty, that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle." The impeachment of Donald Trump has been one of those earnest struggles for liberty. In this fight, like so many before it, it has been a fight against tyranny. This struggle has not been an easy one, and it has left too many people across our nation feeling cynical. For too many people, this trial confirms something they've always known, that the real power in this country lies not with them, but with just a few people who advance their own interests at the expense of others' needs. For many, the injustice in this trial is yet another example of the way that our system of justice has worked, or more accurately, failed to work. But here's the thing. Frederick Douglass also told us that, quote, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." He went on to say, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." And he said, "It never did, and it never will." In order to wrestle power away from the few people at the very top who abuse their power, the American people are going to have to fight for the voice of the people and the power of the people. We must go into the darkness to shine a light, and we cannot be deterred, and we cannot be overwhelmed, and we cannot ever give up on our country. We cannot ever give up on the ideals that are the foundation for our system of democracy. We can never give up on the meaning of true justice. And it is part of our history, our past, clearly our present, and our future, that in order to make these values real, in order to make the promise of our country real, we can never take it for granted. There will be moments in time and history where we experience incredible disappointment, but the greatest disappointment of all will be if we give up. We cannot ever give up fighting for who we know we are. And we must always see who we can be, unburdened by who we have been. That is the strength of our nation. So after the Senate votes today, Donald Trump will want the American people to feel cynical. He will want us not to care. He will want us to think that he is all-powerful and we have no power. But we're not going to let him get away with that. We're not going to give him what he wants, because the true power and potential of the United States of America resides not with the president, but with the people, all the people. So in our long struggle for justice, I will do my part by voting to convict this lawless president and remove him from office. And I urge my colleagues to join me on the right side of history. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, considering whether to convict a President of the United States on articles of impeachment is a solemn and consequential duty, and I do not take it lightly. Even before we had a country, our founders put forward the notion of country first, pledging in the Declaration of Independence their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, a pledge they made to an idea, imagining and hoping for a country where no one was above the law, where no one had absolute power. My dad, a World War II veteran, and my mom raised me to understand that this is what made our country the unique and indispensable democracy that it is. My obligation throughout this process has been to listen carefully to the case that the House managers put forward and the defenses asserted by the President's lawyers, and then to carefully consider the constitutional basis for impeachment, the intent of our founders, and the facts. That's what I have done over the past few days. The Senate heard extensive presentations from both sides and answers to the almost 200 questions that senators posed to the House managers and the President's advocates. The facts clearly show that President Trump abused the public's sacred trust by using taxpayer dollars to extort a foreign government into providing misinformation about a feared political opponent. Let me repeat that. The President of the United States used taxpayer money that had been authorized, obligated, and cleared for delivery as critical military aid to Ukraine to try to force that country to interfere in our elections. He violated the law and the public trust, and he put our national security and the lives of Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines of Russian aggression at risk. Although the country was alerted to the possibility that the President had crossed a critical line because of revelations about his now infamous July 25th phone call, it is not the phone call alone that led to the President's impeachment. Instead, the phone call was a pivotal point in a scheme that had started earlier, spearheaded by President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Mr. Giuliani has acknowledged that he was doing the President's personal and political bidding when he engaged with the Ukrainian government. And as the newly elected anti-corruption Ukrainian government came into power, in need of recognition and support from the United States, President Trump forced officials from Ukraine and the United States to negotiate through Mr. Giuliani, conflating his personal and political interests with the national security and diplomatic interests of our country. And then, as President Zelensky resisted the request that he concoct and announce a fake investigation into the Bidens, the President and Mr. Giuliani increased the pressure. Suddenly and without explanation or a legally required notification to Congress, the President ordered that previously approved and critically needed military aid to Ukraine be held up. Mr. Trump, at first through Mr. Giuliani, and then directly solicited interference with an American election from a foreign government. And he ordered others in his administration to work with Mr. Giuliani to ensure this scheme's success. Mr. President, while there is still more evidence that the Senate should have subpoenaed, both witnesses and documents, that would have given us a more complete understanding of what happened, we know as much as we do because of the courage and strength of American patriots who put country before self. Patriots like the intelligence community whistleblower, who was followed by Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, and former U.S. ambassadors to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch and William Taylor, as well as current members of the administration. These Americans who came forward were doing exactly what we always ask of citizens. If you see something wrong, you need to speak up. See something, say something. It is a fundamental part of citizenship to alert each other to danger, to act for the greater good, to care about each other and our country without regard to political party. When Americans step forward, sometimes at real risk to themselves, they rightly expect that their government will take the information they provide and act to make them safer, to protect their fundamental rights, That's the understanding between the American people and their representative government. And while the brave women and men who appeared before the House did their jobs, the Senate under this majority has unfortunately not. Rather than gathering full, relevant testimony under oath and with the benefit of cross-examination, the Senate majority has apparently decided that despite what it has heard, it is not interested in learning more. Not interested in learning more about how a president, his personal agent, and members of his administration corrupted our foreign policy and put our nation's security at risk. Not interested in learning more about how they plan to use the power of his office to tilt the scales of the next election to ensure that he stays in power. Not interested in learning more about how they worked to cover it up. Increasingly, over the last few days, the President's defense team and more of my colleagues here in the Senate have acknowledged the facts of the President's scheme. Their argument has shifted from he didn't do it to he had a right to he won't do it again, or even it doesn't really matter. I disagree so strongly. The idea that in our country, established by the very rejection of a monarchy, the president has absolute power is absurd, as is the idea that this president, whose conduct is ultimately the cause of this entire process, will suddenly stop. President Trump continues to invite foreign powers to interfere with our elections, maintaining to this day that it was, quote, a perfect call. Mr. President, our founders knew that all people, all leaders, are fallible human beings. And they knew that our system of checks and balances could survive some level of human frailty, even in as important an office as the presidency. The one thing that they feared it could not survive was a president who would put self-interest before the interests of the American people, or who didn't understand the difference between the two. As citizen-in-chief and one wielding enormous power, presidents must put country first. So our founders knew that we needed a mechanism to hold presidents accountable for behavior that violated that basic understanding and that would threaten our democracy. And they provided a mechanism for removal outside of the election process because of the immense damage a president could do in the time between elections. Damage in the case of this president's continuing behavior to our national security and election integrity. Our founders believed that they were establishing a country that would be unique in the history of humankind, a country that would be indispensable, built on the rule of law, not the whims of a ruler. Generation after generation of Americans have fought for that vision because of what it has meant to our individual and collective success and to the progress of humankind worldwide. That's the America that I have sworn an oath to protect. I will vote in favor of both articles of impeachment because the president's conduct requires it, Congress's responsibility as a co-equal branch of government requires it, and the very foundation and security of our American idea requires it. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, on the day I was sworn in as a United States Senator, I took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. Just last month, at the beginning of the impeachment trial, I took a second oath to do fair and impartial justice, according to the same Constitution I swore to protect. As I took the oath and throughout the impeachment trial, I couldn't help but think of my father. As many of you know, I lost my dad over the holiday recess. While so many were arguing over whether or not the Speaker of the House should send articles of impeachment to the Senate, I was struggling with watching him slip away, while only occasionally trying to weigh in with my voice to be heard about the need for witnesses in the upcoming impeachment trial. My dad was a great man, a loving husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, who did his best to instill in me the values of right and wrong as I grew up in Fairfield, Alabama. He was also a fierce patriot who loved this country. Although fortunately he was never called on to do so, I firmly believe he would have placed his country even above his family because he knew and understood fully what America and the freedoms and liberties that come with her mean to everyone in this great country and significantly to people around the world. I know he would have put his country before any allegiance to any political party or even to any president. He was on the younger side of that greatest generation who joined the Navy at age 17 to serve our great military. That service and love of country shaped him into the man of principle that he was, instilling in me those same principles. And think of him, his patriotism, his principles, and how he raised me. I am reminded of Robert Kennedy's words that were mentioned in this trial. Few men are willing to brave the disapproval of their fellows, the censure of their colleagues, the wrath of their society. Moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. Yet it is the one essential, vital quality for those who seek to change a world that yields most painfully to change. Candidly, to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I fear that moral courage, country before party, is a rare commodity these days. We can write about it and talk about it in speeches and in the media, but it is harder to put into action when political careers may be on the line. Nowhere is the dilemma more difficult than in an impeachment of the President of the United States. Very early on in this process, I implored my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in both houses of Congress to stay out of their political and partisan corners. Many did, but so many did not. Even the media continually view this entire process through partisan political eyes and how it may or may not affect an election. That is unfortunate. The country deserves better, and we must find a way to move beyond such partisan divides. The solemn oaths that I have taken have been my guides during what has been a difficult time for the country, my state, and for me personally. I did not run for the Senate hoping to participate in the impeachment trial of a duly elected president, but I cannot and will not shrink from my duty to defend the Constitution and to do impartial justice. In keeping with my oath as senator and my oath to do impartial justice, I resolved that throughout this process I would keep an open mind, to consider the evidence without regard to political affiliation, and to hear all of the evidence before making a final decision on either charge against the president. I believe that my votes later today will reflect that commitment. With the eyes of history upon us, I'm acutely aware of the precedents that this impeachment trial will set for future presidencies and Congresses. Unfortunately, I do not believe that those precedents are good ones. I am particularly concerned that we have now set a precedent that the Senate does not have to go forward with witnesses or review documents, even when those witnesses have firsthand information. And the documents would allow us to test not just the credibility of witnesses, but also test the words of counsel of both parties. It is my firm belief that the American people deserve more. In short, witnesses and documents would provide the Senate and the American people with a more complete picture of the truth. And I believe the American people deserve nothing less. That's not to say, however, that there is not sufficient evidence in which to render a judgment. There is. As a trial lawyer, I once explained this process to a jury as like putting together the pieces of a puzzle. When you open the box and spread all the pieces on the table, it's just an incoherent jumble. But one by one, you hold those pieces up, and you hold them next to each other and see what fits and what doesn't. And even if, as was often the case in my house growing up, you're missing a few pieces, even important ones, you more often than not see the picture. As I've said many times, I believe the American people deserve to see a completed puzzle, a picture with all of the pieces, pieces in the form of documents and witnesses with relevant firsthand information, which would have provided valuable context, corroboration, or contradiction to that which we have heard. But even with missing pieces, our common sense and life's experiences allow us to see the picture as it comes into full view. Throughout the trial, one piece of evidence continued to stand out for me. It was the President's statement that under the Constitution, we have Article 2 and I can do anything I want. That seems to capture this President's belief about the presidency, that he has unbridled power, unchecked by Congress or the judiciary or anyone else. That view, dangerous as it is, explains the President's actions toward Ukraine and Congress. The sum of what we've seen and heard is, unfortunately, a picture of a president who has abused the great power of his office for personal gain. A picture of a president who has placed his personal interest well above the interest of the nation, and in so doing, threatened our national security, the security of our European allies, and the security of Ukraine. The evidence clearly proves that the president used the weight of his office and the weight of the United States government to seek to coerce a foreign government to interfere in our election for his personal political benefit. His actions were more than simply inappropriate. They were an abuse of power. When I was a lawyer for the Alabama Judicial Inquiry Commission, there was a saying that the chairman of the Inquiry Commission and one of Alabama's great judges used to say, Randall Cole. Judge Cole used to say about judges who strayed from the canons of ethics that the judge left his post. Sadly, President Trump left his post with regard to the withholding of military aid to Ukraine and a White House visit for the new Ukrainian president. And in so doing, he took the great powers of the office of the President of the United States with him. Impeachment is the only check on such presidential wrongdoing. The second article of impeachment, obstruction of Congress, gave me more pause. I've struggled to understand the House's strategy and their failure to fully pursue documents and witnesses and wished that they had done more. However, after careful consideration of the evidence developed in the hearings, the public disclosures, the legal precedents, and the trial, I believe that the President deliberately and unconstitutionally obstructed Congress by refusing to cooperate with the investigation in any way. While I am sensitive to protecting the privileges and immunities afforded to the President and his advisors, I believe it's critical to our constitutional structure that we also protect the authorities of the Congress of the United States. Here, it was clear from the outset that the President had no intention whatsoever of accommodating Congress when he blocked both witnesses and documents from being produced. In addition, he engaged in a course of conduct to threaten potential witnesses and smear the reputations of the civil servants who did come forward and provide testimony. The President's actions demonstrate a belief that he is above the law, that Congress has no power whatsoever in questioning or examining his actions, and that all who do so at their peril. That belief, unprecedented in history of this country, simply must not be permitted to stand. To do otherwise risks guaranteeing that no future whistleblower or witness will ever come forward, and no future president, Republican or Democrat, will be subject to congressional oversight as mandated by the Constitution, even when the President has so clearly abused his office and violated the public trust. Accordingly, I will vote to convict the President on both articles of impeachment. In doing so, I am mindful that in a democracy there is nothing more sacred than the right to vote and respecting the will of the people. But I'm also mindful that when our founders wrote the Constitution, they envisioned a time, or at least a possibility, that our democracy would be more damaged if we failed to impeach and remove a president. Such is the moment in history that we face today. The gravity of this moment, the seriousness of the charges, and the implication for future presidencies and Congresses all contributed to the difficulty with which I've arrived at my decision. I am mindful, Mr. President, that I am standing at a desk that once was used by John F. Kennedy, who famously wrote Profiles in Courage, and there will be so many who will simply look at what I'm doing today and say it is a profile in courage. It is not. It is simply a matter of right and wrong. Doing right is not a courageous act. It is simply following your oath. Mr. President, this has been a divisive time for our country, but I think it has nonetheless been an important constitutional process for us to follow. As this chapter of history draws to a close, one thing is clear to me. As I've said before, our country deserves better than this. They deserve better from the President. They deserve better from the Congress. We must find a way to come together, to set aside partisan differences, and to focus on what we have in common as Americans. While so much is going on in our favor these days, we still face great challenges, both domestically and internationally. But it remains my firm belief that united, we can conquer them and remain the greatest hope for the people around the world. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that my full statement be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, today the United States Senate is called upon to uphold our oath of office and our duty to the Constitution because President Trump failed to do that himself. After listening closely to the impeachment managers and the President's defense team, weighing the evidence that was presented to us, and being denied the opportunity to see relevant documents and hear from firsthand witnesses, I will vote to find President Trump guilty on both articles of impeachment. I take no pleasure in voting to impeach a president and remove him from office. I agree with those who say impeachment should be rare and American voters should decide our elections. That is why it's so galling President Trump blatantly solicited foreign interference in our democratic process, and he did it as he geared up for re-election. The evidence shows President Trump deliberately and illicitly sought foreign help to manufacture a scandal that would elevate him by tarnishing a political rival. He attempted to undermine our democracy using U.S. taxpayer money in the form of U.S. military aid to the Ukraine as leverage for his own personal benefit. The president's aides, who heard President Trump's call seeking a favor from the Ukrainian president, immediately sensed it was wrong. So when they alerted the White House lawyers, the record of the call was immediately placed on a highly classified computer system. And despite the president's claiming that the version of the call that was publicly released is an exact word-for-word transcript of the conversation, we know from testimony that there are key omissions in the document we all read. Compounding the president's misconduct, he then engaged in an extended cover-up that appears to be ongoing to this day. There is a lot to unravel here, and I will provide a more detailed legal explanation in the near future. But for now, let me briefly explain my decision and outline my thoughts on the Senate's impeachment proceedings and the disturbing precedents I fear will be set when the majority chooses to side with the president over the Constitution's checks and balances. The House of Representatives voted to impeach the president for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Based on the uncontested evidence, I concur. It is clear that President Trump and others, such as Mr. Giuliani, who was serving as the president's lawyer, attempted to coerce the newly elected president of the Ukraine to announce 2 sham investigations, including one that sought to directly damage President Trump's rival in the upcoming election. The president's actions served his personal and political needs. not those of our country. His efforts to withdraw military aid and withhold military aid to Ukraine for his own personal benefit undermined our national security. The second article of impeachment charges the president with obstruction of Congress for blocking testimony and refusing to provide documents in response to House subpoenas in the impeachment inquiry. Again, the House managers produced overwhelming evidence of the president's obstruction and his efforts to cover up his malfeasance. The president's counsel offered a number of unpersuasive arguments against this article, which failed to overcome the following. First, that the legislative branch has sole power over impeachment under the Constitution. That couldn't be more clear. Second, past precedents of prior administrations and court rulings. And third, the blatant October 8th letter expressing a complete rejection of the House's impeachment proceedings. The Constitution grants the executive branch significant power, but as every student in America learns, our system is one of checks and balances, so that no branch is entirely unfettered from oversight and the law. President Trump could have us and would have us believe this system of checks and balances is wrong. In President Trump's own words, he expressed the misguided imperial belief in the supremacy of his unchecked power, stating, and I quote, "I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president." Couple this statement with his January 2016 boast that, quote, "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose votes." That paints a chilling picture of someone who clearly believes, incorrectly, that he is above the law. The president's attorneys have hewn to this line of faulty reasoning, and in one notably preposterous effort even claimed the president could avoid impeachment for an inappropriate action motivated entirely by his own political and personal interest. The president's defense also failed to sufficiently demonstrate that the president's blanket defiance of subpoenas and document requests overcome the precedents established in prior impeachment proceedings and the record of congressional oversight of the executive branch. In the Clinton impeachment, there was an enormous amount of documentary evidence, as well as sworn depositions and testimony by the president and his closest advisors. In the case of the United States v. Nixon, House Judiciary Committee v. Myers, and others, the House managers rightly point out that the courts have held Congress's power to investigate is as broad as its power to legislate and lies at the heart of Congress's constitutional role. While President Trump's impeachment lawyers claim the House should take the president to court over these previously settled issues, President Trump's lawyers at the Justice Department are simultaneously arguing in the courts that the judicial branch cannot even rule on such matters. As President Trump staked out new, expansive, and aggressive positions about executive privilege, immunity, and the limits of Congress's oversight authority, Republican leaders went along with it. I've heard a variety of explanations for why my Republican colleagues voted against witnesses, but no one has offered the simplest explanation. My Republican colleagues did not want to hear new evidence because they have a hunch it would be really, really bad for this president. It would further expose the depth of his wrongdoing and would make it harder for them to vote to acquit. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle did not ask to be put in this position. President Trump's misconduct forced it upon them. But in the partisan rush to spare President Trump from having his staff and former staff publicly testify against him under oath, a bar has been lowered. A constitutional guardrail has been removed. The Senate has been voluntarily weakened, and our oversight powers severely diminished. This short-term maneuver to shield President Trump from the truth is a severe blow against good government that will do lasting damage to this institution and our democracy. I hope one day the damage can be repaired. The arc of history is indeed long, and it does bend towards justice, but not today. Today, the United States Senate and the American people have been denied access to relevant, available evidence and firsthand witnesses. We've been prohibited from considering new material information that became available after the House's impeachment vote. The Constitution is our national compass, but at this critical moment, clouded by the fog of President Trump's misconduct, the Senate majority has lost its way, no longer guided by the Constitution. In order to regain our moral bearings, stay true to our core values, and navigate a better path forward, we must hold President Trump accountable. The president was wrong to invite foreign interference in our democracy. He was wrong to try and stonewall the investigation. And he is wrong if he tries and he thinks he is above the law. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I ask the quorum call be lifted.
We're not in a quorum call.
All right.
The senator is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. From the first words of the Constitution, the weight that lies on every American's shoulders has been clear. We, the people, are the ones who dreamed up this wild experiment that we call America, and we, the people, are the ones charged with ensuring its survival. That's the tension, the push and the pull behind our democracy. Because while there's no greater privilege than living in a country whose Constitution guarantees our rights, there's no greater burden than knowing that our actions could sap that very same Constitution of its power. That our inaction risks allowing it to wither like any other piece of parchment from some bygone era. For the past few weeks, it's been my sworn duty as a United States Senator to sit as an impartial juror in the impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump. And while I wish the president hadn't put our nation in this position, after listening closely, with an open mind, to both sides, it is now my duty as an American to vote on whether to remove him from office. Other than sending our troops into harm's way, I cannot think of a more serious, more somber vote to take in this chamber. But as sobering as it is, the right path forward is clear. Throughout this trial, we've seen unprecedented obstruction from the Trump administration. Obstruction so flagrant it makes Nixon, in the thick of Watergate, look like the motto of transparency. And yet the facts uncovered still prove the truth of the matter. Trump abused his power when he secretly withheld security aid at a White House meeting to try to force Ukraine to announce its investigations into a political rival to help him swing November's election, putting his political self-interest ahead of our national security. He smeared the name of an American ambassador, even seemingly risking her safety because she was simply too principled to further his corruption, because she was too clean to help him strong-arm Ukraine into that favor he demanded. When the reports first emerged about what he'd done, he denied it. Then his explanation changed to, well, maybe I did do it, but it was only because I was trying to root out corruption. Except that if that were true, there'd be some documentary record to prove that, and we've seen absolutely none, even after I asked for it during the questioning period. And now, his defense team has gone so far as to claim that, well, it doesn't matter if he did do it because he's the president and the president can do anything he wants. It will help him get reelected. Breathtaking. To put it another way, when he got caught, he lied. Then when that lie was found out, he lied again, then again, then again. And along the way, his own defense counsel could not papier-mâché together even the most basic argument to actually exonerate him. The best case they could muster boiled down to, well, when the president does it, it's not illegal. Nixon already tried that defense. It did not work then, and it does not work now. Because here's the thing, in America, we believe not in rulers, but in the rule of law. And though we've seen over the past few months, the truth has never changed. It's what National Security Council officials and decades-long diplomats testified to under oath. It's what foreign policy experts and Trump administration staffers, and yes, an American warrior with a Purple Heart, have raised their right hands and told us time after time since the House hearings began. Even some of my Republican colleagues have admitted that Trump crossed the line. Some said it as recently as this weekend, but many more said months ago that if Trump did do what he's accused of, then it would indeed be wrong. Well, now it's obvious that those allegations were true. And it's pretty clear Trump's defense team knows that also. Because if they actually believe Trump did nothing wrong, that his call was perfect, then why would they fight so hard to block the witnesses and the documents that could exonerate him from coming to light? The only reason they would have done so is if they knew that he was guilty. And today, the only reason for anyone to vote to acquit Trump is if you're okay with him trying to cover it up. Now, I know that some folks have been saying that we should acquit him, that we should ignore our constitutional duty and leave him in office because we are in an election year, and that the voters should decide his fate. That's an argument that rings hollow, because this trial was about Trump trying to cheat in the next election and rob the voters of their ability to decide. So any action other than voting to remove him would give him the license and the power to keep tampering with that race, to keep trying to turn that election into as much of a sham as an impeachment trial without witnesses. You know, I spent 23 years in the military, and one of the most critical lessons anyone who serves learns is the damage that can be done when troops don't oppose illegal orders, when fealty becomes blind and ignorance becomes intentional. And just as it's the duty of military officers to oppose unlawful orders, it is the responsibility of public servants to hold those in power accountable. Former National Security, former NSC official Fiona Hill understood that, testifying before Congress because she knew that politics must never eclipse national security. Ambassador Bill Taylor understood that as well. The veteran who served in every administration since Reagan's answered the question at the heart of the impeachment inquiry, saying under oath that, yes, there was a clear understanding of a quid pro quo, exactly the sort of abuse of power no president should be allowed to get away with. And Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, the Purple Heart recipient who dedicated decades of his life to our armed forces, he understood the lessons of the past too, saying that here in America, right matters. My colleagues in this chamber who have attacked Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who have provided a platform for others to tear him down, just doing what he believes is right, should be ashamed of themselves. We should all be aware of the example we set and always seek to elevate the national discourse. We should all be thoughtful about our own conduct, both in terms of respecting the rule of law and the sacrifices our troops make to keep us safe. Because at the end of the day, our Constitution is really just a set of rules on some pieces of paper. It is only as strong as our will to uphold its ideals and hold up the scales of justice. So today, I am asking each of us to muster up just an ounce of the courage shown by Fiona Hill, Ambassador Taylor, and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. When our names are called from the dais in a few hours, each of us will either pass or fail the most elementary, yet most important test any elected official will ever take, whether to put country over party or party over country. It may be a politically difficult vote for some of us, but it should not be a morally difficult vote for any of us. Because while I know that voting to acquit would make the lives of some of my colleagues simpler come election day, I also know that America would have never been born if the heroes of centuries past made decisions based on political expediency. It would have been easier to keep bowing down to King George III than to push 342 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor. It would have been easier to keep paying taxes to the crown than to wage a revolution. But those patriots knew the importance of rejecting what's easy if it's in conflict with what is right. They knew that the courage of just a few could change history. So when it's time to vote this afternoon, we cannot think of political convenience. If we say abuse of power doesn't warrant removal from office today, we'd be paving the way for future presidents to do even worse tomorrow, to keep breaking the law, to keep endangering our country, one perfect call, one favor, one high crime and misdemeanor at a time. Time and again these past few months, we've heard one story about our founders, perhaps more than any other. The time that Benjamin Franklin walked out of the Independence Hall after the Constitution Convention and someone asked, "What have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" We all know what he said: a republic, if you can keep it. Keeping it may very well come down to the 100 of us in this very chamber. We are the ones the Constitution vests with the power to hold the president accountable, and so, through our actions, we are the ones that vest the Constitution with its power. So in this moment, let's think not just of today, but of tomorrow too. And in this moment, let's remember that here, right matters, truth matters. The truth is that Donald Trump is guilty of these articles of impeachment. I will vote to do the right thing, and I hope my colleagues will as well. For the sake of tomorrow and the tomorrow after that, we must. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I move we suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, later today, I'll vote to acquit the President on the charges of the 2 articles of impeachment. Now, a not guilty verdict, as every senator on this floor has known for some time, was always what would happen in a House-driven partisan impeachment process. Less than a year ago, the Speaker of the House said that we should not go through this process unless something was compelling, unless something was overwhelming, unless something was bipartisan. I think the Speaker was exactly right then, and I hope all future speakers look at that guidance as we think about this process of impeachment. In the first 180 years of the Constitution, individual members talked about impeachment of presidents, maybe of almost every president, but the Congress only seriously touched this topic one time. One time in 180 years, Mr. President. In the last 46 years, presidential impeachment has been before the country 3 times, and each case has been less compelling than the one before it. We don't want partisan impeachment to become an exercise that happens when one party, not the party of the president, happens to have a majority of the votes in the House of Representatives. Impeachment is fundamentally a political process. The members of the Senate meet no standards for a regular jury. The jury can override the judge. 2/3 of the Senate is necessary to remove the president. We really have no better term in the Constitution, I suppose, to use than trial. But in any classic sense, this isn't a trial. In any classic sense, a partisan impeachment isn't any kind of a real indictment. And maybe first and foremost, Mr. President, the House has to do its job. A part of that job would be to create a case that would produce a bipartisan vote on the articles in the House. And if you haven't met that standard, going back to the Speaker's standard, you should work on the case some more and then wonder if you can't meet the standard, what's wrong with the process you're going through. Part of that job is to do everything necessary to have articles of impeachment that are compelling and complete. The House has time available to it to consider impeachment as they go about their essential work. They can continue to do the work of the Congress. They have weeks, months, if they choose to have even maybe years to put a case together. They can call witnesses. They can go to court to seek testimony. They can determine if this is an impeachment question or just an oversight question. The House, Mr. President, can do lots of things, but once the Senate gets the articles of presidential impeachment, they become, for the Senate, an absolute priority. Both our rules and reality mean we can't do anything else realistically until we're done dealing with the case the House sent over. That was fundamentally what was so wrong with the House sending over a case that they said needed more work. If it needed more work, it should have had more work. Now, Mr. President, you can be for strong review of the executive, you can be for strong congressional oversight and still support the idea of executive privilege. The president has the right to unfettered advice and to know all the options. In fact, I think when you pierce that right, you begin to have advisors who may not want to give all the options to the president because it might appear they were for all the options. But the president's advisors need to see that the president understands all the options and implications of a decision. The president, by the way, another topic that came up here several times, the president determines executive policy. The staff, the assistants, that whoever else works in the executive branch doesn't determine executive policy. The president determines executive policy. The staff can put all the notes in front of the president they want to, but it's the president's decision what the policy of the administration would be. And sharing that decision with the Congress, sharing how he got to that point, or later she got to that point with that decision, is a negotiated balance. Congress says, we want to know this. The president says, no, I need to have some ability for people to give me advice that isn't all available for the Congress. So this is balanced out. And if that can't happen, if that balance can't be achieved, the judiciary decides what the balance is. The judiciary decides a question, says, you really must talk to the Congress about this, but you don't have to talk to them about the next sentence you said at that same meeting. That's the kind of balance that occurred. The idea repeatedly advanced by the House managers that the Senate, by majority vote, can decide these questions is both outrageous, Mr. President, and dangerous. The idea that the government would balance itself is frankly the miracle of the Constitution. Nobody had ever proposed until Philadelphia in 1787, one, that the basis for government was the people themselves, but two, you could have a government that was so finely balanced that it would operate and maintain itself over time. The House managers would really upend that balance. By being unwilling to take time, the House had to pursue the constitutional solution. They've decided that we don't have to worry about the Constitution to have that solution. To charge that the president's assertion of Article II rights that go back to Washington is one of the actual articles of impeachment is dangerous. The legislative branch cannot also be the judicial branch. The legislative branch can't also decide, here's the balance. Executive and legislative branch are in a fight about what should be disclosed and what shouldn't. You can't continue to have the three balances of power in our government if one of the branches can decide what the legislative branch should decide. In their haste to put this case together, the House sent the Senate the two weakest articles of impeachment possible. Presidents since Washington have been accused by some members of Congress of abuse of power. Presidents since Washington have been accused by some members of Congress of failure to cooperate with the Congress. The House managers argued against their own case. They repeatedly contended that they'd made their case completely, they'd made their case totally, they'd made their case incontrovertibly, but they wanted us to call witnesses that they'd chosen not to call. They said they'd already been in court 9 months to get the president's former White House counsel to testify and weren't done yet, but somehow they thought the Senate could get that person and others in a matter of days. These arguments have been and should have been rejected by the Senate. Today, the articles of impeachment should be and will be rejected by the Senate. Based on the Speaker's March comments, these articles should have never been sent to the Senate. They were not compelling, they were not overwhelming, they were not bipartisan, and most importantly, Mr. President, they were not necessary. One of the lessons we send today is to this House and to future Houses of Representatives, do your job, take it seriously, don't make it political. I would yield back and note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I've long maintained that most, if not all, of the most serious, vexing problems within our federal government can be traced to a deviation from the twin core structural protections of the Constitution. There are two of these protections, one that operates along a vertical axis, the other a horizontal. The vertical protection we call federalism, which states a very simple fact that in the American system of government, most power is to be reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people, where it's exercised at the state and local level. It's only those powers enumerated in the Constitution, either in Article 1, Section 8 or elsewhere, that are made federal. Those things that the Founding Fathers appropriately deemed unavoidably, necessarily national, or that we have otherwise rendered national through a subsequent constitutional amendment. As was the case when James Madison wrote Federalist Number 45, the powers reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite, while those that are given to the Congress to be exercised federally are few and defined. Few and defined powers with the federal government, numerous and indefinite, reserved to the states. The horizontal protection operates within the federal government itself, and it acknowledges that we've got three co-equal independent branches within the federal government. One that makes the laws, one that executes the laws, and one that interprets the laws, where people can't come to an agreement and have an active, live dispute as to the meaning of a particular law in a particular case or controversy. Sadly, we have drifted steadily, aggressively from both of these principles over the last 80 years. For roughly the first 150 years of the founding of our republic and of the operation of our constitutional structure, we adhered pretty closely to them. But over the last 80 years or so, we've drifted steadily, and this has been a bipartisan problem. It's one that was created under the flawed leadership of Republicans and Democrats alike. In fact, of Senates, of Houses of Representatives, and White Houses of every conceivable partisan combination. We have essentially taken power away from the American people in two steps. First, by moving power from the state and local level and taking it to Washington in violation of the vertical protection we call federalism. And then a second time, moving it away from the people's elected lawmakers in Washington to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats placed within the executive branch of government, but who are neither elected by the people nor accountable to anyone who is electable. And thus, they constitute essentially a fourth branch of government within our system, one that is not sanctioned or contemplated by the Constitution and doesn't really fit all that well within its framework. This has made the federal government bigger and more powerful. It has occurred in a way that has made people less powerful. It's made government in general, in particular this government, the federal government, less responsive to the needs of the people. It has been fundamentally contrary to the way our system of government operates. What, one might ask, does any of this have to do with impeachment? Well, in my opinion, everything, or at least a lot. You see, this distance that we've created in these two steps, by moving power from the people to Washington, within Washington, handing it over from elected lawmakers to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, has created an understandable amount of anxiety among the American people. Not all of them necessarily recognize it in the same way that I do, or describe it with the same words, but they know something's not right. They know that when their federal government requires them to work many months out of every year just to pay their federal taxes, only to be told later it's not nearly enough and hasn't been enough for a long time, such that we've accumulated $22, $23 trillion in debt. And when they come to understand that the federal government also imposes some $2 trillion in regulatory compliance costs on the American people, that this harms the poor and middle class. It makes everything we buy more expensive. It results in diminished wages, unemployment, and underemployment. On some level, the American people feel this. They experience this. They understand it. It creates anxiety. It was that very anxiety that caused people to want to elect a different kind of leader in 2016, and they did. It was this set of circumstances that caused them to elect Donald J. Trump as the 45th President of the United States. And I'm glad they did, because he promised to change the way we do things here, and he has done that. But as someone who has focused intently on the need to reconnect the American people with their system of government, Donald Trump presents something of a serious threat to those who have occupied these positions of power. These individuals who, while hardworking, well-intentioned, well-educated, and highly specialized, occupy these positions of power within what we loosely refer to as the executive branch, but it is in reality an unelected, unaccountable fourth branch of government. He has bucked them on many, many levels and has infuriated them as he's done so, even as he is implementing the American people's wishes to close that gap between the people and the government that is supposed to serve them. He's bucked them on so many levels, declining to defer to the opinions of self-proclaimed government experts who claim that they know better than any of us on a number of levels. He pushed back on them, for example, when it comes to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, as it's sometimes described, when he insisted that FISA had been abused in efforts to undermine his candidacy and to infringe the rights and the privacy of the American people. So he took that position. Washington bureaucrats predictably mocked him, but he turned out to be right. He called out the folly of engaging in endless nation-building exercises as part of a 2-decade-long war effort that has cost this country dearly in terms of American blood and treasure. Washington bureaucrats mocked him again, but he turned out to be right. He raised questions with how U.S. foreign aid is used and sometimes misused throughout the world, sometimes to the detriment of the American people and the very interests that such aid was created to alleviate. Washington bureaucrats mocked him, but he turned out to be right. President Trump asked Ukraine to investigate a Ukrainian energy company, Burisma. He momentarily paused U.S. aid to Ukraine while seeking a commitment from the then newly elected Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky regarding that effort. He wanted to make sure that he could trust this recently elected President Zelensky before sending him the aid. Within a few weeks, his concerns were satisfied, and he released the aid. Pausing briefly before doing so isn't criminal. It certainly isn't impeachable. It's not even wrong. Quite to the contrary, this is exactly the sort of thing the American people elected President Trump to do. He would and has decided to bring a different paradigm to Washington, one that analyzes things from how the American citizenry views the American government. This has, in some respects, therefore, been a trial of the Washington, D.C. establishment itself, but not necessarily in the way that the House managers apparently intended. And while the House managers repeatedly invoked constitutional principles, including separation of powers, their arguments have tended to prove the point opposite of the one they intended. Yes, we badly need to restore and protect both federalism and separation of powers. And it is my view that the deviation from one contributes to the deviation from the other. But here, in order to do that, we've got to respect the three branches of government for what they are, who leads them, how they operate, and who is accountable to whom. For them to view President Trump as somehow subservient to the career civil servant bureaucratic class that has tended to manage agencies within the federal government, including the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, the Office of Management and Budget, individuals in the White House, and individuals within the State Department, among others, is not only mischaracterizing this problem, It helps identify the precise source of this problem. You see, many of these people, including some of the witnesses that we've heard from in this trial, have mistakenly taken the conclusion, but because President Trump took a conclusion different than that offered by the so-called interagency process, that amounted to a constitutionally impeachable act. It did not. It did nothing of the sort. Quite to the contrary, when you actually look at the Constitution itself, it makes clear that the president has the power to do what he did here. The very first section of Article 2 of the Constitution, this is the part of the Constitution that outlines the president's authority, makes clear that the executive power of the United States government shall be vested in the President of the United States. It's important to remember that there are exactly two federal officials who are elected within the executive branch of government. One is the vice president, and the other is the president. The vice president's duties, I would add, are relatively limited. Constitutionally speaking, the vice president is the president of the Senate, and thus performs that in a quasi-legislative role. But the vice president's executive branch duties are entirely bound up with those of the president. They consist of aiding and assisting the president as the president may deem necessary, and standing ready to step into the position of the presidency should it become necessary as a result of disability, incapacitation, or death. Barring that, the entire executive branch authority is bound up within the presidency itself. The president is the executive branch of government, just as the judges who sit across the street themselves amount to the capstone of the judicial branch, just as 100 senators and 435 representatives are the legislative branch. The president is the executive branch. As such, it is his prerogative within the confines of what the law allows and authorizes and otherwise provides to decide how to execute that. It is not only not incompatible with that system of government, it is entirely consistent with it, indeed authorized by it, that a president should be able to say, look, we've got a newly elected president in Ukraine. We've had long-standing allegations of corruptions within Ukraine. Those allegations have been well-founded in Ukraine. No one disputes that corruption is rampant in Ukraine. A newly elected president comes in. This president, or any president in the future, decides, hey, we're giving a lot of aid to this country. $391 million for the year in question. I want to make sure that I understand how that president operates. I want to establish a relationship of trust before taking a step further with that president. And so I'm going to take my time a little bit. I'm going to wait maybe a few weeks in order to make sure that we're on a sure footing there. He did that. There's nothing wrong with that. What's the response from the House managers? Well, it gets back to that interagency process. As if people who the American people don't know or have reason to know, because those people don't stand accountable to the people, they're not elected by the people, they're not really accountable to anyone who is in turn elected by the people. The fact that these people involved in the interagency process might disagree with a foreign policy decision made by the President of the United States, or the fact that this President of the United States might take a different approach than his predecessor or predecessors, does not make this President's decisions criminal. It certainly doesn't make them impeachable. It doesn't even make them wrong. And Mr. President, in the eyes of many, I believe most Americans, they want a president to be careful about how the United States spends money. They want the United States to stop and reconsider from time to time the fact that we spend a lot of money throughout the world on countries that are not the United States. We want a president of the United States to be able to exercise a little bit of discretion in pushing pause before that president knows whether he can trust a newly elected government in the country in question. And so to suggest here that our commitment to the Constitution, to suggest here, as the House managers have, that our respect for the separation of powers within the constitutional framework somehow demands that we remove the duly elected president of the United States is simply wrong. It's elevating to a status completely foreign to our constitutional structure, an entity that the Constitution does not name. It elevates a policy dispute to a question of high crimes and misdemeanors. Those two are not the same thing. At the end of the day, this government does, in fact, stand accountable to the people. This government is of, by, and for the people. We cannot remove the 45th President of the United States for doing something that the law and the Constitution allows him to do without doing undue violence to that system of government, to which every single one of us has sworn an oath. We've sworn to uphold and protect and defend that system of government. And that means standing up for the American people and those they have elected to do a job recognized by the Constitution. I will be voting to defend this president's actions. I'll be voting against undoing a vote taken by the American people some 3.5 years ago. I'll be voting for the principle of freedom, for the very principles that our Constitution was designed to protect. I urge all of my colleagues to reject these deeply factually and legally flawed articles of impeachment, to vote not guilty. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
Will the senator withhold?
Yes.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Mr. President, I rise today to officially declare that I will vote against both articles of impeachment brought against President Trump by the very partisan and, quite frankly, ridiculous House of Representatives. I know my position is hardly a surprise, but it's almost as unsurprising as the House impeaching the President to begin with. Since the moment he was sworn into office, Democrats have schemed to remove Donald Trump from office. It's not my opinion. I take them at their word. Their fixation on his removal was a conclusion in search of a justification, which they manufactured from a phone conversation between world leaders, leaked by one of the many career bureaucrats who seem to have forgotten that they work for the elected leaders in this country, not the other way around. So, Mr. President, the two articles of impeachment before this body today, in my view, are without merit. They are an affront, in fact, to this institution and to our Constitution, representing the very same partisan derangement that worried our founding fathers so much that they made the threshold for impeachment this high. Mr. President, the Senate exists exactly for moments like this. I didn't arrive at my conclusion to support acquittal hastily or flippantly, and I don't believe any of my colleagues did either, including those who come to a different conclusion from mine. Despite being sent such flawed articles by the House, the Senate did, in fact, dutifully and solemnly follow its constitutional obligation. During the long days of the trial, we heard sworn testimony from 13 witnesses, read 17 depositions, asked 180 questions, viewed 193 video clips, and poured over 28,000 pages of documents. But even more than the House manager's shallow arguments and lack of evidence against and due process for our president, and the obvious derangement at the very root of every investigation, beginning with the corrupt FBI Crossfire Hurricane counterintelligence investigation during the 2016 election cycle. The articles of impeachment we'll vote on in a few hours should have ended at their beginning. Mr. President, can we agree that if a Speaker of the House unilaterally declares an impeachment inquiry, it represents the opinion of one member of Congress, not the official authorization of the entire Congress? Can we agree that a vote to begin an impeachment inquiry that has only partisan support and bipartisan opposition is not what the founders had in mind, and in fact is what they firmly rejected and cautioned about? Can we agree that impeachment articles passed by a majority of one party and opposed by members of both parties, on their face fail, if not the letter of the law, certainly the spirit of the Constitution. Yet, even under the cloud of purely partisan politics of the House of Representatives, the Senate conducted a complete, comprehensive trial, resulting, in my view, in a crystal clear conclusion. The Democratic-led House of Representatives failed to meet the most basic standards of proof and has dramatically lowered the bar for impeachment to unacceptable levels. Mr. President, it's deeply concerning, and I believe we must commit to never, ever letting it happen again to the president of any political party. And that can start today. In just a few hours, the Senate will have the opportunity to cast a vote to end this whole ordeal. And in doing so can make a statement that the threshold for undoing the will of the American people in the most recent election and undoing the will of a major political party in the upcoming election should be higher than one party's petty obsession. Mr. President, I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle join me in voting against these charges. But whether he's acquitted or convicted and removed, it's my prayer, as we were admonished many times throughout the last few weeks by our chaplain Black, that God's will is the one that will be done. Then we can move on to the unifying issues the American people want us to tackle. Issues like infrastructure, education, energy security and dominance, national security, and the rising cost of health care, among many others. These, Mr. President, are issues the American people care about. These are issues that North Dakotans care about. These are the issues that the people have sent us here to deal with. Let's do it together. Let's start now. I yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Mississippi.
are we in a quorum call?
We are.
I ask with unanimous consent it be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I will vote to acquit President Donald J. Trump on both articles of impeachment presented by House Democrats. I have listened carefully to the arguments presented by the House Democratic managers and the White House defense team. Those prosecuting the president failed on a legal and constitutional basis to produce the evidence required to undertake the very serious act of removing a duly elected president from this office. This trial exposed that pure political partisanship fueled a reckless investigation and the subsequent impeachment of the president on weak, vague, and non-criminal accusations. The Democrats' case, which lacked the basic standards of fairness and due process, was fabricated to fulfill their one long-held hope to impeach President Trump. We should all be concerned about the dangerous precedent and consequences of convicting any president on charges originating from strictly partisan reasons. The Founding Fathers warned against allowing impeachment to become a political weapon. In this case, House Democrats crossed that line. Rejecting the abuse of power and obstruction of Congress articles before us will affirm our belief in the impeachment standards intended by the founders. With my votes to acquit President Trump, justice will be served. The Senate has faithfully executed its constitutional duties to hear and judge the charges leveled against the president. I remain hopeful that we can finally set aside this flawed partisan investigation, prosecution, and persecution of President Trump. The people of Mississippi and this great nation are more interested in us getting back to doing the work they sent us here to do. I yield my time.